So as I mentioned, what I'm going to talk about, I'll just let you absorb the shock of that super long title. But what I'm going to be talking about is really recent work that's actually different from normal empirical work I've done, or even modeling machine learning work that I've done, in the sense that it's actually presenting a framework, a method, or a formula for taking any particular technology and then redesigning components of it, like a website, so that we can actually allow it to become intelligent and adapting by actually bringing together collaborative work between practical designers, behavioral scientists, like psychologists who run experiments, and also people in machine learning who focus on reinforcement learning, who focus on using algorithms to automate experimentation and personalization. I'm part of this new group at Harvard, Harvard VPAL, Vice Provost Advanced in Learning. There's actually a research group within it, and a lot of what we do is look at how we can use things like MOOCs as a tool to help people learn, but also to advance science of how people learn. If you want to see a recording afterwards or just slides, I put them in this URL, tiny.cc/williamstalk. So here's the kind of problem I think that we all think about. Technology never really keeps up with what we need from it. So here's your ISP website. How many of you could change this right now? Suppose you see something you think could be clearer or improved. How would you even get in there to make the change? How do you evaluate it empirically? Also, isn't it kind of strange that you basically have the same website when you have so many different users? There's current grad students, there's people looking to apply, there's faculty. This technology just isn't meeting needs in the sense of it's going to be static and lag behind what we really need to accomplish. It's also not going to be personalized or adaptive to different profiles of users. The exact same thing happens in contexts like online courses, where MOOCs give the same experience to every person. And in particular, the pipeline from collecting data about what's happening, what's working, to actually going back to change design is a really long one. And it's funny, if you contrast this to how teachers or actual humans tend to interact with us, it's completely different. So that's just a picture of my high school in Trinidad. And so there's, let's say, my favorite that's my favorite high school math teacher. As she's talking to us, it's marked how different her interaction is from a static website. The best human interaction is adaptive. And it's adaptive in at least two ways. It's adaptive in the sense that she might explain something one way for the first person, but when she tries the second time, she's actually trying out different explanation. She's noticing what works and she's improving over time. Whereas that same MOOC might be running for years with only pretty marginal changes, because once it's loaded, it's basically a teacher frozen in time. They're also adaptive to different people. So she might explain that one way to my friend and another way to me. So we get personalized explanations. Again, something that doesn't happen when you've got technology that's one size fits all. And so it's kind of a pity we have these problems where technology just isn't moving quick enough to improve using data, and it's not personalized, because that's actually what it would be perfect for. Technology could allow some really clever adaptation. Because it's a digital resource instead of a physical experience, you can rapidly iterate. You might imagine I give one talk and I figure out what works and I rapidly change it. It's kind of hard for me to do that because I'm an analog projection right here. I'm talking, I have to give the talk again. If this whole talk is written out in text, you just have to go and tweak words and you can rapidly iterate. It's also personalized ideal for personalized different user profiles. Again, everyone in this room is getting a one-size-fits-all version of my talk. If this talk was, for example, recorded or written, I could actually splice many different versions, and as each of you arrive, you get a slightly different version. In particular, technology is ideal for collecting data on a large scale and actually allowing us to test hypotheses, where I might actually, my intro, I might start it off in 3 different ways and then actually see which one's helping people. So there's this huge opportunity that's just not being met. So in an ideal world, in a sort of utopia, how would we be able to use technologies like websites, like mobile apps, even like the emails we get? Well, ideally, once they're deployed in the real world and real users are using them, it's still possible to go in and make changes. It's possible to test those changes, and as soon as we get data that one version is better than another, we can actually cycle that in. If we get data that one version is better for a certain subset of people, or a different user profile, like whether faculty or grad students are browsing a site, that data will also allow us to automatically, for example, using machine learning, learn how to personalize. So this website wouldn't be static, it would be constantly evolving. So we're a long way from that. here's a bit of an overview of the kind of approach that I'm trying to take towards this. And I'm going to just demonstrate on some very small-scale problems. So I thought a bit about the problem and opportunity, which I think we all agree on is an important one. So the approach I'm taking is basically a framework that I've came up with about a year and a half ago for trying to take any technology. You kind of come to me with your website, with your mobile app, with your emails that you're sending. How can we make that components of that adaptive? So you might show different versions to different people. In particular, that's a very general statement. I'm going to talk about a very specific formalism, which I've named the MOOClet or AdapComp. I'm happy for better improvements. That basically is a way of implementing technology so that it realizes these goals of rapid iteration and personalization. And then I'm going to discuss briefly how this connects related work. Then I'm going to talk about one example, an application of crowdsourcing explanations. And then I think I won't have time, but I'm going to just let you know that I might have talked about application dynamically personalizing emails. I think I'm going to wave in front of your eyes like a magic trick. In terms of future directions, I'd be really curious as you look at this, how do these kinds of ideas provide a tool to you? Because in a way, this is human-computer interaction research where the users are not just the students. The users are actually behavioral scientists, experimental psychologists, machine learning researchers, and people who actually have to design technology. So I'd be really curious to get your thoughts. In a way, the future directions are going to depend very much on, could you imagine using this somewhere? Is this something you can imagine trying to collaborate and being a beta user? We have about 5 ready, but being the next round for this kind of framework. So I'm going to try and gloss over this quickly because I think it'll make a lot more sense once I get through examples. But here's an example of one way we've used this framework. So you start off with something like edX, which someone mentioned, or it could be your PIT website. And basically, this is just a wall. How do you... My mouse is trapped in the other dimension. How do you actually make any changes to this? What data can you get out of this website? Well, I've worked with enough platforms, like I've had to run experiments on Khan Academy, on edX, on Coursera, on NovaEd, on Moodle, to know if you haven't seen that data in front of your eyes, just assume it's near impossible to get. If you haven't seen that you can randomize something, then just it's a good bet to assume it may be incredibly difficult. So here's the kind of approach. Let's designate modular components of something like this. For example, this explanation. So here's a math problem. Someone attempts it. They can get right or wrong feedback. But then they actually have the option to ask for an explanation of why a particular answer is correct. So in most websites like Khan Academy and assessments, when everyone studies with them, there's just one version of the explanation. But what if we made that into what I'm going to call a MOOClet, a component where we can make multiple versions, and then we can actually collect data and apply machine learning algorithms to automatically learn which versions are helping people learn. So the idea here would be, we want to take this simple, modest explanation, just a bunch of text, and convert that into a micro lab. So there'll be different versions, which could come from students, or they could come from a psychologist who's trying to look at something like the effect of framing on people's behavior. And then associated with each of these is going to be some data about the users. Data from before, data from afterwards, data about behavior. And when I say data here, I'm also going to just include variables, experimental variables. And you'll see a bit why that's going to be important. And then finally, there's going to be a policy. So the policy is basically saying, given some data about a user, given some options that you could present them with, how should I be presenting these? And how do I present them to different users? Now, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when I was straight up thinking as my hat as experimental psychologist, this is not a question. It's answered. I present them with basically equal numbers in every condition. I randomize in the sense of I flip a coin to do assignment by randomizing with equal weights. If they're 3, 33% across the condition. Not 50, 25, 25, 33 all the way. On the other hand, you could also have policies that just try to help people. So you might think about optimization. As soon as you think there's some reason to believe this explanation is the best, like the instructor even says so, or you see 1 or 2 students liking it, well, maybe you should just give 100% of people that. You could also think about personalization. Well, maybe if someone's got a low pretest score, they get that explanation. If they've got a high one, they get that. And of course, you can think of many things that come in between this. But the kind of basic idea here is that this little micro lab, this component, is encapsulating all of these different needs of an experimental psychologist, of someone who builds intelligent adaptive systems, who would want to discover the ideal policy, and of an instructor, who really and truly is kind of okay with helping research in my experience, but wants to help their students and minimize the effort to them. Yes?
So in this version, the table of data for users and the conditions and such, that's instructor insert, right?
No, this is actually totally agnostic. This is just saying that there needs to be something associated with that. What you see here would likely be the instructor might, you can basically think of this table as being a gigantic box where everyone dumps their stuff in it. So the experimental psychologist might say, well, here are the conditions I want to assign people to. The person who's running the course, the engineers might say, here's a dump of all the data we have about your students. And then someone who's running a machine learning algorithm might actually provide some high-level features. So it's basically just a whole, just think of it as like a gigantic Excel file associated with each user. So I could put this with an explanation, but you could also imagine that you have this kind of approach with videos, with text on a page, even with emails you send to people. And the key idea, again, is that each of these would feed into a central set of data and have a policy for delivering them. They're all sort of levels with which to impact people's behavior. So I'm going to call one of these components a MOOClet or an AdapComp. The reason I use that word, and in a review I got for a recent conference paper, someone's pretty disparaging about why are you adding this other random word? You're just taking some components and experimenting with them, right? You're personalizing them. We've done that for years. I absolutely agree, we've done that for years. I think what I'm trying to get at by giving it a specific lexical entry is that, and when I say MOOClet, I don't just mean some modular thing. I actually mean a specific formal concept. There's a set of criteria where if you tell me, here's a web page on my homepage, here's the text at the top. I can tell you by going through these if and only if conditions whether it's a MOOClet or not. It's really important to be able to specify these because the real work that I've put into this is figuring out how to specify these formal conditions so that if you satisfy these, then you're basically in the land of milk and honey. I'm exaggerating there, but basically encapsulates concerns that a lot of experimental psychologists, machine learning, and instructors all care about. So I'm going to just drop the formalism on you and get it thinking. It won't make sense now, but with repeated exposure, it might. Basically, a MOOClet is a technology component, like a lesson, an exercise, an explanation email, that meets these three criteria. Multiple versions can be easily inputted at any time. So I'm thinking here of these being added just as easy as someone typing them in. Delivery of these versions is specified using a modifiable policy of if-then rules. That's this policy here. And it can be modified dynamically. And these rules reference a modifiable list of variables linked to each user. So on the question before, that's why it's important. This is really a gigantic bucket. We're not making assumptions about what's in there. All we know is that a MOOClet will allow you to add versions, change the policy on the fly, and make the rules be based on data here, where data could be features of users, or it could be experimental conditions. One reason this is so important is because it basically is a way of design technology, so it enforces a formal equivalence. Yes?
So these slides talk about the motivation of designing adaptive websites. So if we look at current websites, the closest that we can look at is probably Amazon or something.
Yes.
Trying to sell these things. And they have a vast amount of information about you, and they still don't formulate it. They're trying to sell it to us based on where it comes from. As compared to that, when you look at learning something, I think that's even more sophisticated. Why am I not learning something? How do you make these if-then rules based on that information?
So one thing I should say is that this is not a solution for that problem. What this is basically a solution to a different problem. If you have that problem of wanting to optimize products for people or wanting to increase your students' learning, you're going to attempt it in different ways. If you, like me and others, you're going to run some experiments, you can read the prior literature, you're going to use your intuitions. This is basically saying, whatever you're doing, if you design your technology in this way, it's going to give you a big leg up because it's going to allow you to do a lot of different things. It's going to allow you to use machine learning to discover what's working and for who. It's going to ensure that you get data in real time as opposed to having to do batch learning every month or so on. One thing I should probably, I'll make an explicit connection to the kinds of things that Amazon and so on do after this. So one thing that's really key in this way of designing technology is that it's pretty much spells out equivalence. How many of you have recently thought, well, doing a randomized experiment is formally equivalent to personalizing? If you think about randomly assigning explanations to people, this one or that one, versus personalizing, and by personalizing, I don't mean to the individual person as a snowflake. I just mean to someone who has a user characteristic, like being from Trinidad or the US. Personalizing is basically assigning it where the variable is set as a function of a user characteristic. So this technology basically enforces this equivalence, and that has many valuable consequences. Because basically, you can write down a policy here that says, well, if users conditions equal A, then let's show explanation 1. If it's B, let's show explanation 2. And now actually, personalization is just the other side of the coin. Basically, it's saying, well, let's say if knowledge is low, then show explanation 1. If knowledge is high, then show explanation 2. So there's actually formal equivalence between experimentally manipulating a variable, delivery of content, and personalizing that content. Where when you're experimenting, it's set as a function of a random variable. When you're personalizing, it's set based on user characteristic. One way that I could have explained all this is basically to say, when you take technology and you set it up to do randomized experiments, what's called A/B testing, we're doing it all wrong. Because normally we actually set it up so that we can just do randomization. If you're really sophisticated, you can set it up so that you can start 50-50 and trail out. So you get like 60-40 and 80-20. And that's what Amazon does. But Amazon and Microsoft and Google are not the people who benefit from this. They've got gazillions of dollars and a huge infrastructure for this. Ron Kohavi, who runs Microsoft and set up Amazon's randomized experimentation framework, works with 80 engineers or more. This is basically saying to you, if you, on your website or in your course, or edX or Coursera is implemented, they need to implement A/B testing as a MOOClet. Because it doesn't just give them randomization. With a bit more work, it gives them the ability to personalize for free. And what's really important, I think, is that it actually gives them the ability to discover how to personalize. Because if you think about it now, every single experiment you run is an opportunity to discover interactions. In the lab, typically, we don't have that much variation. In the online setting, you've got very diverse samples. And so we start off experimenting, but we always leave open the possibility we can discover some interaction between this explanation is better on average than that one, but it differs for low or high knowledge students. If you discover that interaction, then how do you actually put that into practice? You might publish it and be happy, but how does the instructor actually benefit? How do they know that you're going to do ethical experimentation? Well, it's actually just a simple matter of changing the if-then rules. So this is kind of part of the power, because even very sophisticated machine learning researchers, when I've seen them, for example, run experiments with cognitive tutors, they'll have one policy for randomization. They run it on 80 students. Then they'll actually say, well, look what's happening. Let's go and re-implement it. Then they'll actually go to their programmer, have them do a bunch of other things, and then roll that back out. This basically says that without any programming or structural changes, you can actually transition very smoothly among a whole wide range of policies. Okay. So maybe I can just give one example of applying this to making an adaptive explanation via MOOClet. So I'm mentioning here the context of someone solving a math problem. They can enter the answer, get right or wrong feedback, and then they can request an explanation. So that explanation is what we're making in MOOClet. Here's how I actually implemented this in a recent study, which I'll go on to discuss. But I'm just showing you now the kind of key conceptual idea behind this and one application to how it helps us. Well, basically now, I want to say, well, I can tell you, in edX and most websites are not built to let you go in and change these. If they have a what you see, what you get, you go and you change it, and it's gone. That's like it. They've got an A/B testing feature that lets you provide several. But if you want to then actually you find that one is better than another, you've actually then got to basically go and rip that feature out and just put the old explanation back in. What it would mean for it to be a MOOClet, if you remember the three kind of key features. One is that you can easily input these extra versions. So, for example, I actually implemented this in a Google spreadsheet so that it's actually something I could share with anyone. Basically, you type in the explanation here, and that's your interface for adding MOOClets. Every time you type a new explanation, it just gets added in and they can get piped in so the actual students see it. So 1,000 students go through and see these explanations, you add another one, 1,001 student could get assigned to it. What's the other component of the MOOClet? Well, there's got to be a policy. So now, again, I implement that in a Google spreadsheet, where basically you could start off with one policy, which is saying, well, let's give the first explanation to 50% of people and the second to 50. But then you might actually just, at any point in time, switch another policy, which would say, well, let's give the first explanation to 65% of people, the second one to 35%. If you want to do a policy that actually had to do with personalization, you might then actually say, well, let's actually just have different rules for different features. If someone's, sorry, I can do that well, but if someone's familiarity with these problems is less than 5, then let's say that 90% of them get this explanation, 20% get that. If the familiarity is really high, where they've seen this problem before, well, maybe actually it's better to give them 30% of them get this explanation, 7% get that. And these numbers are dynamic and changing. But the kind of key idea is that you could by hand go and enter these things, because it's just switching these if-then rules. But what's also essential is that any algorithm could be processing this data in real time and dynamically changing this policy. The other thing is that data about users is actually, again, made available. So how familiar they are with the problem, which version they got, how they rated the helpfulness of the explanation, accuracy in the next problem. So every single time someone touches that, this data is available in real time. So it's actually feeding back into the loop. These are basically the features you get that you're guaranteed once you fulfill those criteria. And I think you can start to see how this opens up a lot of doors. If you're running randomized experiments as a psychologist, if you're an instructor, if you want to actually do real-time machine learning. In particular, reinforcement learning. Okay. So they're just blowing it up a bit and putting alternative explanations. And I'm actually happy to share this with anyone. And policy change. So here I'm just showing examples, but the way you set this up is that you could be analyzing the data here, and then you can actually send back a policy because you just express it in these terms instead of if-then rules. So I'm going tomorrow to a workshop on NIPS, which is basically, it's called machine learning from and for user technologies, from active experimentation to optimization, personalization. It basically means that all those algorithms that are normally analyzed theoretically and run in simulated data, you can actually test them in real time, and you can compare them against each other. In terms of enabling collaboration between instructors and researchers, the nice thing here is that this is something that I can tell you I've struggled with a lot, over the last 3 or 4 years. The instructor and researcher now have a common language. What's the experiment going to be? That's what the psychologist is thinking. Well, here are the versions. What data have I got? Here are my dependent variables. All that's being available in real time so that you can actually basically no one be guaranteed getting that data. Whereas, for example, when I've run this, with almost every platform, it can take months to actually get data, even know what's there. The instructor now has a lot of ethical guarantees. They know exactly what the conditions are, and they also know what data is visible to the researchers or not. So this is then, in a way, kind of language or framework that actually helps enable instructor-researcher collaborations. And one thing I will mention a bit later is there's a website called Assessments. So if you just Google Assessments, like assessment but assessments, we're actually, it's run by Neil Hefner at Worcester Polytechnic, and we're actually working on basically setting up the math problems there. So you could actually just go and propose an experiment inside of math problems that students are using every day. And we can use this framework with teachers basically to see, okay, you're proposing to add this explanation of that, or this motivational message. Here's the data you're going to get in real time. So this is actually something that you can even do right now in Assessments as well as in MOOCs where I've been using it. The key thing I mentioned here is that a MOOClet serves as an abstraction for reinforcement learning. Once you satisfy those conditions, you actually are guaranteeing a machine learning researcher, they don't even have to know what you did. I mean, they'd probably like to know, but they don't actually have to know anything except that it's a MOOClet. And they can actually apply basically any set of reinforcement learning algorithms out of the box. So for example, the basic reinforcement learning is that there's a set of environment states S. There's a set of actions you can take. there are rules for transition between states, rules for the reward of transition, and rules to describe what you observe. If you're not a reinforcement learning fan, don't worry, I'm just going to run through this for people who are, and I'll catch on the next slide. But basically, how does that map onto MOOClet? Well, the state space, or the observed variables, are combinations of user characteristics. So essentially, you can think of that simple little explanation as being an agent that is in a state space when it looks at a user's profile. What's their age? What are the last 3 things they got wrong? What prior experience they have? That's the state space that they're acting in. Basically, all that information is available in the user variable store. Or anything in there can be input to the state space, and you make decisions about what to look at. The action space are basically alternative MOOClet or AdapComp versions. So 3 different versions of explanation on the actions. And again, because it's a MOOClet, you will guarantee you keep adding actions as time goes on. The reward function is something that you choose here. Either the instructor does as a user of this framework, or a researcher does. What measure of learning or engagement or behavior do you want to optimize? An instructor might really care about how long someone spends on a page, whereas a psychological researcher would care more about whether they learn on a specific transfer measure. You might think of optimizing their rating for an explanation or how much they learn the next problem. You can think about this as a multi-objective optimization, or at least a framework that allows you to sort of tackle these questions in a real-world context. I think I should emphasize a lot of this is, I'm not saying this is like I've suddenly come up with these concepts, they're well in the literature. I think the key thing here is really being able to use all of these methods in a real-world setting with a piece of technology that's already deployed in the wild, and which you want to have control over. And of course, the policy. Based on someone's state space or user characteristics, what actions do we take? Do we just do it randomly, like in a psychological experiment? Are we going to have some priors about how to personalize? And how do we update this policy over time? So a heads up to you, I'm going to actually just talk about the special case where the state space is not changing. I'm going to assume basically that there's a fixed state space of user variables, because in context I'm going to look at, we basically don't ever see a user twice. So every time a user comes in, it's as if we just have that context, we act on them, and then they're gone. So this is something in reinforcement learning that's known as contextual and bandits, or even just multi-arm bandits where there's no side information or context for the user. But you can basically apply any reinforcement learning approach here. Okay, so this is the workshop. If you're interested, actually, I'm streaming it by Google Hangouts, the same way I'm doing it here. Tiny.cc, ML, AI, HCI for machine learning, AI, HCI. And basically, it's on a lot of these topics. If you're interested, it would be great to have your thoughts and suggestions. It's on tomorrow, and it'll be recorded. So in terms of related work, I think I'll come back to this discussion period. As I mentioned, there's a huge amount of work on A/B testing in industry. Randomized experiments are the cornerstone of a lot of science. I think the kind of key idea here is, how do we conceptualize that simple thing of a randomized experiment for different people? It's really simple, right? It's almost deceptively. Assign conditions, measure outcome on some variable. But for a psychologist, this is a tool for discovering causal structure by testing hypotheses. For an instructor, this is a way of evaluating designs. And for someone who's doing machine learning, this is basically a way of exploring to try and optimize some function. There's a huge degree of machine learning and especially work on bandits that we can now actually bring to bear in a real world context, like students actually doing explanations. And I think that a lot of this is very much inspired by working in adaptive hypermedia intelligent tutoring systems. I think the kind of key thing that's different here is that instead of building these systems with a lot of expert knowledge and particularly small validated studies, this is meant to be a method for settings where if you wanted to build an intelligent tutoring system from scratch, if you're in a new domain like, third year computer science on topic X, Y, or Z, well, something like this approach should be helpful because it allows you to specify a set of actions, some target variables to optimize, and then you can actually start testing those out. And you design your technology where it makes that easy for you. I think one thing that's also helpful is that, again, by making it easy to collaborate, I think it can actually open up a really big space. The action space in ITSs is often whether to give someone another problem or not, or a problem of a certain type. But if you pull a psychologist, just pull them out of the audience or pull them from anywhere, and you give them one of these problems, they have enormous wealth of ideas. Should you compare two problems? Should you ask someone to form an analogy with what came before? Should you get them to quiz themselves? Basically, you can think of psychologists as helping generate an action space. And this kind of framework will let you explore, I think, a broader range of instructional variables. And some key work in HCI that really focused on the idea of, let's make it really easy for people who aren't software engineers, who are end users, to actually write things that are sophisticated programs, where someone who's a psychologist or instructor could actually be providing input to a multi-arm bandit algorithm, and then that's actually optimizing learning for them. Okay, so sorry, I think I spent a lot of time on that. But just to kind of check in where we are, common opportunity, the approach. And now here's an example of applying this to crowdsourcing explanation. So now I'm going beyond the sort of conceptual contributions of this formalism framework to just say, here's something that I was able to do with this that I would not have thought about doing 2 years ago, or would have been prohibitively difficult. So again, using the same example of taking an explanation for a math problem. Which you'll remember me for. This is a paper that hopefully will be accepted at Learning at Scale. It got good reviews. ACM's Learning at Scale, where basically we built this adaptive explanation improvement system. It's basically meant to be a system that you can give to an instructor or to anyone, that basically they say, I'm going to plug this into my explanation for how to solve a math problem, or of how honeybees produce honey. And then it's actually going to dynamically elicit explanations from learners, crowdsource them, and then use multi-arm bandit algorithms for machine learning to detect which ones are helpful on average. So the computational problem here is, how do we optimize explanations by automatically experimenting? And the design problem for technology is, how do we help learners explain and read these explanations while also doing useful computational work with the explanations they're generating? I think the key idea here is that we're taking something that's so simple, it's an explanation, and we're turning that into an intelligent adaptive agent by basically baking algorithms into the underlying infrastructure. So here's the interface for this access system. So as I mentioned, learners are basically solving a math problem and getting feedback. And then they've got the option to sort of get an explanation. So we augment that scenario, which is common across MOOCs, Khan Academy, assessments, by having people, by adding to the interface, where we have people rate their prior knowledge. So they see a math problem, and they're asked, well, actually, here's a math problem. Mary's music store had 5 truckloads of CDs delivered. Each truck dropped 12 boxes. Each box has 6 CDs. Writing expression for how many were delivered. You probably didn't ever want to see this again after algebra in our middle school, right? Sorry to drop the nightmare on you. So people rate, in general, how well you think you'd understand how to solve problems like this one. And we'll be able to solve them correctly. They give a rating. Then actually, we give, after they attempt the problem, type in the answer until if it's right or wrong, we give them an explanation. And so this is basically going to be that MOOClet. At the beginning, there may be no explanation at all, in which case they don't get anything, or there might just be one explanation from, let's say, the last learner. But then actually, if they do get an explanation, we ask them to rate how helpful was this explanation for learning. And then they're given what's called a self-explanation prompt in educational literature. Explain in your own words how to solve this problem. So now, what's happening here is that we've basically augmented the interface to do things that instructors wanted us to do for learners. They wanted actually us to get learners to explain their reasoning, and there's a lot of evidence this actually helps learning, just explaining with no feedback. That's what my dissertation was on. And also, we kind of force them to just think about an explanation by rating it. But at the same time, we're producing useful computational information. We're actually producing new explanations from learners. And we're now actually getting some data about whether explanation 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 was actually judged as helpful. So here's how we formulate. Now we want to actually use algorithms to basically learn which explanations are helpful. In this situation, we actually just haven't looked at context yet. I've been looking at the data and it's a bit promising, but that's not what we focused on. So the kind of key is we have to think about defining our reward function. What are our actions or arms of a bandit? And what's the context? In this case, nothing. And then, well, how are we changing the policy? So there are a wide range of algorithms that you can use in this context. Epsilon greedy, upper confidence bound, Thompson sampling. I'm just going to talk about the last one that we used, and I can explain later why we chose it. The problem we're seeing here for this MOOClet, this intelligent adaptive agent that prevents explanations, is basically we decide to maximize the ratings of an explanation. We can talk later about why we didn't choose a learning measure, but there are good reasons to think about it. We actually just want to maximize the average rating that learners are giving to the explanations they receive, of how helpful these explanations are for learning. The MOOClet of the AdapComp is basically which of the explanations is being presented. Now, the reward function is the rating, no context vector, and the action space are different explanations. We're actually going to be boosting this action space as we collect more explanations. Whenever it passes some minimum threshold of quality, as rated by the learner themselves, it gets added to the action space. And now the policy we actually use here is Thompson sampling. And I'll explain what that means. Okay, so I'm just going to say it very quickly, then we can get technically. But basically, the idea behind Thompson sampling is that we should choose an action in proportion to the probability that that is the best action. So if there were 3 explanations, and right now you would see them presented to 10 learners each, you would have some estimate of how likely it was that each of those, what the average rating was. Was it 6 for explanation 1, 7 for explanation 2? But you'd have uncertainty about that. So Thompson sampling basically uses simple statistical models and basically samples each of those actions in proportion to the probability that has the highest rating. The rating here was on a 1 to 10 scale, and we did this using beta priors. What that basically means is that as we get more and more evidence that explanation 2 is 8 out of 10, and the other explanations are 6 or 7, we can start presenting explanation 2 more and more frequently. And so eventually this is going to converge, and it's been shown to have optimal regret guarantees to basically giving the highest ranked explanation. So what we did was we actually deployed the system with just 150 people, a small number because it's meant to see in something like a lecture class. And so I'm just throwing these before you, but basically, by the end of those 150, we had 10 different explanations. And what you can imagine is there's a policy or the probability that any one of these explanations will be presented. And we looked at a snapshot of that with 76 learner, after 7 people going through, and then after 150 learners. And basically what you kind of see happening is that at the beginning, of course, there's a bit of noise. The system's able to select some explanations. But over time, what actually happens is that a large number of explanations are seen as actually reasonably good. And this data isn't shown most clearly, but basically it weeds out some of the explanations, but it's not the case that it's converging on just one best one. In terms of evaluating it, what we want to do is have a separate control experiment where we could take the products of those explanations and evaluate whether, on average, they were actually improving. So in a separate experiment with 500 people, so a lot more power than we could have before, we presented all the explanations, and we collected people's ratings of whether an explanation, they perceived an explanation made them more likely to solve a problem, how much increased the accuracy in actually helping them solve problems, and we computed basically an access explanation as a sort of weighted sum of the explanation ratings based on the policy. So here's the first basic result. If you just compare the explanations that came out of the system with actually a condition where people just got problems, so people basically, by default, in many sites, don't have any explanations, so they're just solving problems. If we actually deploy Access and start collecting people's explanations, we might actually find a lot of these learners' explanations are actually misleading. They can be confusing, they can cause learning to be worse. What we're at least finding here is that people who are getting these explanations at least feel like they're learning more than when they have no explanations at all. When we look at their rating of how well they can solve problem before and then after. Of course, the ideal measures impact on learning. So what we're seeing here is basically comparing the Access explanations to problems only no explanations. And what I'm showing is the pre to post test increase in accuracy. So we tested them on problems before and after. And this is actually the significant benefits that learners are getting from receiving these explanations. What's interesting is if we compare this to basically unfiltered explanations. So explanations, we basically take all the explanations that learners generate and we don't filter them through Access. You actually see that there's no learning benefit compared to no problems at all. Sorry, there's no learning benefit compared to just doing problems. It's interesting, this is not significantly different, but the Access explanation is actually approaching the quality of explanations that were written by the actual instructor. Yep.
So on the third section, they receive the explanation at random or just one type of explanation?
No, they receive it totally at random from the entire pool of explanations generated by learners.
So is there a formalistic explanation that gives the answer right away?
So one thing I should be clear about is that this is not measuring on the item itself. Basically, they attempt a problem, they get it right or wrong, and then after they've gotten the answer, move forward, then they give an explanation of how to solve that problem. So they can't use that explanation to solve an immediate problem. But basically, they could, so even if the explanation gave for the answer, it's not as likely to affect the pre to post test measures because the pre-test items were just totally different problems. They had different numbers. Okay. So I think the kind of key insights from this are basically, here's one example of a system we're able to deploy by using some of these MOOClets, where we actually were able to take a small component, provide explanations, and redesign it so that we could pull in these different actions, these different explanations, and then use a pretty simple algorithm, Thompson sampling, to automatically select the best. And you could kind of imagine there are many other contexts where you could apply this approach. Basically, an explanation is any bit of text. It could be motivational messages, it could be paragraphs, it could be anything you can communicate in words to another person. So that's kind of where we are here. And I think I'm actually just going to flash this before your eyes to let you know. The other step, of course, is personalizing. And so we actually did the same thing, but in a very different context, where the MOOClet now was basically components of an email, where an instructor in Harvard MOOC wanted to say, I'd like to send these emails out to people to get feedback on my course in a survey. And I'd just like you to maximize the response rate. So what we did then was actually just design a study where we got a psychologist, that was actually me, putting on my psychologist hat, to generate many different versions of subject lines, to generate different versions of intro messages, in always a 3x3x3 condition. And then we had some context like people's age group and how many days are active in the course. And basically what we did was actually run something similar to Thompson sampling. And this, if I had time to show you, would give you a really good intuition for basically how you can think of Thompson sampling as taking you from an experiment we typically run in psychology is kind of assuming like we have a prior, that every condition is equally likely to help. But as we collect more and more data, we should actually have a posterior. We should believe that condition one's helping more. And so we don't stop the experiment totally, but we do want to present people with something more frequently in proportion to how much it's helping. So the nice thing about this is it actually does preserve the randomness of an experiment. And you have to do a bit of adjustment, but you can still actually trade off running an experiment to discover what's working with actually helping students. So it's kind of giving us a way to ethical experimentation. Basically, there were benefits of doing this approach. Okay. So I think, in summing up, I think the kind of key idea here was thinking about how do we take any piece of adaptive technology and redesign it so that, any piece of technology, redesign it to be adaptive. And in particular, I think I presented a framework and an underlying formalism that basically says anytime you're going to implement technology, randomized experiment, if you do it using this formalism, it gives you advantages because you're basically going to bring together a behavioral scientist's desire to experiment, instructors' desire to do that in an ethical way, and the ability to actually have these self-improving adaptive technologies, which, very modest situation, improving explanations, automatically personalizing emails. But I think it would be really exciting to think about how we can actually scale that to a higher level. All right, so thanks a lot. I just thank everyone who helped with this. Well, you can basically make all here things 3 minutes MOOClets. But thank you to my collaborators. And to you. Thanks a lot. What questions do people have? You have 4 minutes, so you can sprint them out. Yeah.
So it sounds like the personalization component is deterministic, and the experimentation component is that imposes a random variable. So it sounds like the reinforcement component is kind of between the two to some extent. So in your experiment, you did the reinforcement learning, and then afterwards you followed up with a randomized control experiment. So I'm curious, it seems like almost like the reinforcement learning can give you some of that information that a randomized control experiment would give you. Can you imagine any scenario where you would do the reinforcement learning and then your randomized control experiment would show you that you got to the wrong policy or something?
Yeah, I certainly can. I think that's a great point. I mean, the point of this framework is not to solve those problems, basically allow you to even face those problems. Because right now you can't even do this kind of experimentation easily. There are definitely situations where that would happen. For example, it's very nice to be able to change the proportion of people being assigned to conditions. And statistically, that's totally fine as long as your population isn't changing over time. But if actually in a context where I started off randomly assigning people 50-50, and after the first 100 people, I've now assigned them 40-60. And after the next 100, I assign them 20-80. Well, suppose I've done this from the morning to the evening on Mechanical Turk. Then that's actually a problem because now actually there's a correlation between my assignment policy and how many people end up in the condition.
So would you suggest, even if you do reinforcement learning like you did, you should follow up with some sort of controlled experiment?
That'd actually be a sort of judgment call in that particular scenario, but that could definitely be the appropriate approach used in certain situations.
So it would be interesting if you could have more sources of data rather than just pre-test and post-test. For example, Form is working on a project where he is using physiological signals such as heart rate to figure out how much attention a student is paying while watching the video. So those would be interesting to build on your policies and to this.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. That definitely makes sense.
So back to your one-on-one, you had this, what was the gold standard that you were comparing to?
It was basically an explanation written by an instructor. So, so the instructor basically looked at the problems and then wrote an explanation with like investing significant resources, and they provided that to people online. So based on their particular personal experience with the problem and students.
So would it be possible to, maybe if your gold standard that you're actually would also be like an instructor to see how that is.
Yeah, so I think you're thinking of something where you don't even use this kind of adaptive technology at all and just let people go about their business. I think that's absolutely the best standard against which to compare it to. I think I'm happy to do things like that. I wonder if that's actually maybe, I would predict you're not going to see much of an effect right now. Because basically, this is a tool that you're only going to get big benefits if it's helping people discover tons of ways to personalize. So I'd be kind of interested to first see, like, well, can we find anything at all? Because the best thing about experiments is really when you run them, you realize how little things actually have effect in the real world. Things that people will swear they think it's almost unethical to give to a student have no effect on dependent measures we can collect. So I think, I certainly think that's the best evaluation. I think one of the most impactful way to use this is actually on something that's a bit more early stage, kind of showing instructors, well, look, you could just improve your teaching in this way. Yes?
Is the instructor explanation part of your access setup in explanations?
It wasn't, no.
It wasn't?
No.
One question about the way that we personalize the MOOClet. So we've seen that we have policies and we can have, for example, different different versions of the MOOClet for different groups of students. These were defined at the level of MOOClet, which is lesson for exercise.
More or less, yeah. You could define how you want, but in these cases it was, yes.
So how about going, is it possible that with this design we get to higher level where we can define, let's say, batch of lessons or exercise, or define series of items that are delivered to a specific group of students?
Yes, you certainly can. And one thing I should say is that, again, this is a framework to sort of enable research. So I actually think these are not very impressive. That's fine.
No, it's
But-
interesting.
But I'd love to actually see what, if a lot of people use this, what can you actually do more sophisticated? So what you mentioned there, for example, would be ways of doing factorial experiments or aligning interventions. So one thing that we like to run is basically manipulating motivational messages that are given to students, and then also manipulating study strategy tips, with the idea that there might be interesting interactions where people need to be motivated enough to put study strategy tips into place. And so there's a whole, any kind of experiment that you might think of running, you could basically try and express as a policy here. And there are probably lots of things you would think of that I just haven't even begun to look at. But I think that would be definitely a good direction. Okay, so it's 1:32, but thanks so much. And I would definitely appreciate any feedback or suggestions from people. Actually, this was a great crowd. So if it's not too strange, I'd actually just like to get a snapshot to remember who was there. At least I can say, well, who was that person's name who I didn't actually remember? Are you guys okay with that? Just cover your face if you're not. Because basically, it's kind of like an economist where you meet all these people who are doing super relevant stuff, and then you actually have no idea, and you have to troll through some websites. I'm probably just going to forget and lose it, but it might help. All right, thanks so much, everyone.